Okay, so one further short video. This is the last one that relates to the reign of King Canute, and then we'll move on to look at Harold Harefoot and Arthur Canute quite quickly. And before we move on to Edward the Confessor, then that'll be the first mind map done. Some of the events here on the Emma of Normandy section, they go a little bit further than the reign of Canute, and we come back to them again in the reign of Harold Harefoot particularly, but as a foundation it's a good starting point. Okay, so the first thing we have to be able to do whenever we're talking about Emma of Normandy is we have to be able to place her into a very simple family tree so that we just understand how pivotal, and that's one of the tier 2 words that we use, she was pivotal in terms of explaining what was happening in the period of time. Okay, so first things first, when you're drawing the family tree out, very, very helpful, obviously, if you have Emma in the middle of 2 other men. Now, she was first of all married to King Ethelred, and we've been learning a lot about him, the man who becomes, if you like, the last official Saxon king of England before Canute takes over. So Emma was actually brought to England to marry Ethelred when she was only 12 years old. Obviously, she was of Norman descent, but we must understand that the Normans themselves were not so far and away from their Viking roots. So Emma actually married Ethelred, and that marriage took place in 1002. And she married him because Ethelred was going through a very tricky reign, and what he hoped is that if he married Emma, then the Danes, who had kept invading throughout the period, he hoped that in some ways that would make them realise that he was attempting to placate them through that marriage to Emma. The reason we know it's a political marriage is the fact that by this time Ethelred was actually 20 years older than Emma. He was around 32 and she was only 12, so that gives us a nice clue as to the fact that this was a political marriage. And then if you're trying to do that in some depth, we do know that he had to actually finish his first marriage, first of all, because he had been married before. He'd been married to a woman called Ealgifu, and that marriage had actually produced, we think, somewhere in the region of 10 children prior to that time. So 1002 is the marriage of Ethelred to Emma, Emma 12, Ethelred 20 years her senior. Now, in terms of that then, we need to know the children that become the product then of this particular marriage here. So simple line down. Now, although they had 3 children, we actually leave out, very sadly, the girl that they produced, and we add in the 2 men who go into exile at the point that Canute takes over. Very, very important. So Edward and Alfred, the sons of this marriage, are sent into exile in 1016 to Normandy because of Canute taking the throne. So, quite simply then, when Canute became king, that was where he married Emma, and the date for that is obviously 1016 he takes over, but the marriage, we believe, actually took place the next year in 1017. Now, to make it perhaps slightly trickier, but we have to do this, Canute himself was also already married, and wonderfully, he was also married to a woman called Ealgifu, but this is not the same woman. It's quite a common Saxon name. This is not the same woman. Now, again, what we have to be able to do as we look forward is we see the product of the children from his 2 marriages. Now, the first one to add in is just one name that comes from his first marriage here, and this is the man who goes on to become known as Harold Harefoot, okay, who's king after Canute dies. But then we have another son that comes from that marriage, and he is the man who we know in history as Arthur Canute. So first thing, whenever you're learning about Emma of Normandy, is to try and just draw that family tree out, and that'll help you with a lot of the narrative and the story that emerges. Okay, so second point to make then. So when Emma actually marries Canute in 1017, we believe that this is part of the policy of him being an Anglophile, if you recall, and that's a word we can use all throughout Canute's reign. So that policy to be perceived as an Anglophile means that what he does is he marries a woman who has an intimate knowledge of England itself. Now, Emma played a particular role in improving Canute's reputation with the rest of England in a particular way. And what she actually did is she was very helpful with his policies towards the church. So Canute, when he came to England, had a very bad reputation with the English church. He was still technically pagan at the time, and therefore he'd had no problem when he used to invade, and his father before him, attacking and destroying religious buildings and monasteries. So his reputation was improved through Emma assisting him and giving what we would say counsel to him in these matters. So the word counsel means to talk to suggest, to help through. So she counselled him through that difficult period. So his reputation with the church was improved. So reputation was improved with the English church. The other thing to say about that is that Emma was always a political figure. Okay, so it's very, very important that we don't just assume that she was powerful through the fact that she married two kings. She was always a political figure, and she was playing a role in shaping the politics of what was happening in England itself, and indeed beyond that. Okay, so this is another point that takes us slightly beyond the reign of Canute, but it is worth mentioning with Emma in mind. But again, we will revisit it when we look at the reign of Harold Harefoot in the next session. So the next key moment, certainly in her life, came about with the death of Canute. Now, this is an important part for the next piece of the course, because it's very, very clear that when Canute died, there was a potential rivalry between Harold Harefoot, if we go back to the family tree just here, and Arthur Canute, because these were the two most powerful sons coming from both of these marriages, if you see there. Now, the thing that makes that even more intriguing is the fact that Emma could have looked back to Edward and indeed Alfred, who were both still alive in 1035 when Canute dies. And it's interesting where, again, we can see her as a political figure, because clearly she has some quite difficult choices to make at that point. Now, what actually happened is that although Arthur Canute, he was given, if you like, priority to become the next king of England, because Emma's marriage to Canute preceded, Elgifu's marriage preceded the marriage between Emma and Canute. Arthur Canute actually took the throne in Denmark, and it was Harold Harefoot who took the throne in England. So Harold Harefoot actually became king in 1035. Now, it was at this point where we believe that Emma encouraged her two sons from her first marriage to potentially return to England, possibly to take the throne from Harold Harefoot, who is the only one of these four men that Emma had no interest in terms of being king, and she worried about her own position if Harold Harefoot became king. Now, regardless of exactly what happened, and we'll become involved in that debate when we talk about Harold Harefoot's reign specifically, what we do know is that in 1036, Edward and Alfred did return to England, and it actually ended up with Alfred being murdered. Okay, so Alfred being murdered. Now, again, we'll discuss that in a little more depth when we actually look at Harold Harefoot's reign next lesson in a little more depth, as we said. But what's very, very clear is then from the period 1035 through to 1040, which is the dates that Harefoot reigned, Emma was in a very, very precarious position. She'd been a woman of great power for a long period of time, but she was in a very precarious position for 5 years because she had very little power and influence directly over the English throne. Okay, and finally, just something else to add in. So the focus of this particular piece of the teaching is tried to look at Emma not just in terms of these marriages, although they are absolutely vital to understand the rest of the course. It's about looking at her as being an influential political figure through the period as well. Now, just to add one other example in, which is very, very useful, because this is something that happens later on in the course with another famous woman. There was one other way that women could actually exercise, if you like, political power. And this was through the commissioning of chronicles. Now, we've seen in the William Rufus course that we often have chronicles commissioned, say, for example, by monasteries, abbeys, priories, to actually tell history from their own perspective. Now, what Emma actually did is she commissioned a chronicle to be made in her own lifetime that wanted to show that at all those difficult moments in her life, she had actually taken, from her perspective, the right decisions. So what it's actually called is it is called In Memory of Queen Emma. So this was a chronicle, and what it did is say, for example, is when her son Alfred was murdered, people believed that she actually sent a letter to Edward and Alfred, who are in exile in Normandy, and she actually sent a letter inviting them to return. Now, this wasn't part of a trap on her part of a ploy, because at that point it was very, very clear that she didn't want Harold Harefoot to be king. But what she does in the chronicle is she will go on to say that the letter was actually a forgery, and she'll say that the letter was forged by Harefoot as part of a plan to get them to return to actually kill them, which is probably nonsensical. So she says that the letter was forged in 1036, inviting her two sons to return. And so these are quite important parts of the course, because, as I said, we will see later on where another influential and powerful woman attempts, if you like, to write her own history through the use of a chronicle itself. Okay, and so as we've done before, I've placed the focus question just there. If I read it to you, it says, in what way did Emma of Normandy exert power and influence from 1002 to 1036? So a couple of points to make. So we're talking about from 1002 with her first marriage to Ethelred. Please, in your writing, make sure that you're explaining how that is a political marriage and using the evidence as to why. Then you would possibly want to move on to the next marriage she took, linking that to assisting Canute in tying himself to the Anglo-Saxon nobility through his policy of being perceived as an Anglophile, giving counsel to him, particularly in his relationship with the church. Final point to be made would be looking at the year 1035, where it's very clear that her power and influence potentially was about to be lost through the fact that none of her three sons from those two marriages were to be the next king of England, but showing that she was prepared to try and keep her reputation as good queen going through the commissioning of the chronicle itself. So we're looking for a real focus on her power and influence as a political figure.